Welcome to this LRB podcast, the latest in a series about British and American poetry, which draws on the rich archive of essays and reviews and memoirs that have appeared over the years in the London Review of Books. My name is Seamus Perry. I teach English at the University of Oxford, and I'm talking with Mark Ford, poet, critic and Professor of English at the University College London. And our subject today is the great Irish poet Seamus Heaney. So I should qualify my description of this series as being about British and American poetry to being about poetry written in English. Heaney was born in April 1939 in Mossbaum, near Castledown in County Derry, a subject of the British Queen. He went to a boarding school after passing the 11 plus, then on to Queen's, Belfast, on a state exhibition where he obviously had an extraordinarily distinguished undergraduate career, graduating in English with a first. He had a spell as a teacher and then as a lecturer in a college of education, and then moved back to Queen's as a lecturer, where he fell into the company of Philip Hobsbawm, a very charismatic lecturer in the English department at the time, and joined something called The Group, which had, among other members, Michael Longley and Edna Longley and Bernard McClaverty. And this is, as it were, where he cut his teeth as a young poet. But the turning point, Mark, really happens in 1964.
Yes, he sends out poems to various London-based magazines in the early 60s and has no joy. But finally, he gets a telephone call while he's teaching, and it is from the founder of the London Review of Books, Carl Miller, who was at that time editing the New Statesman. And Heaney rushes from his class. He takes the telephone call, and it's Carl at the other end telling him that he'd like to print 3 of the poems that have been brought to his attention. And that then triggers a request from Charles Monteith, who is also from Northern Ireland, but a Protestant rather than a Catholic, for a full manuscript. Heaney rushes home and starts writing more poems, and the result is Death for Naturalist, which launched him in a way which few first books launch poets. It was extremely popular, well received, won prizes, and it established the kind of template of the Heaney poem.
Yes, this is one of those books that you could not say fell stillborn from the press, could you? It won absolutely every prize that was going, and establishes him as a leading poetic voice immediately. I mean, as it were, on a different paradigm, he woke up and found himself famous.
And I think it's worth putting it in the kind of context of the literary or the poetic world at the time, that kind of modernism had run its course to some extent, that there had been the so-called confessional poets in America, such as Lowell, with whom Heaney became very close for a period in the 70s. And there was the movement. The Larkin style poem was kind of dominating the concept of what an English, and I use the word advisedly, an English poem should be. And there were, of course, other poets like Basil Bunting and so on. But Heaney hit a spot with readers who were not particularly enamoured of where modernism had gone to, that the poetry in Death of a Naturalist and then in Door into the Dark and Wintering Out as well kind of hymned a kind of a rural concept of poetry that harked back to the beginning of the century in some ways. I'm not saying that Heaney is can be construed in those terms, but I think part of the initial popularity derived from the extent to which readers could read Digging and say, I know what this poem is about and I can relate to it.
So Digging, you mentioned, Digging is not the first poem he wrote, is it, that was included in the volume, but it's the poem that he put first. And in interview, he described it as a strength giver. Where else could it be placed, he said, except first? And it's first in Death of a Naturalist, and then it's also first in his own selection of his poems, isn't it? So it's like this is the inaugural poem in his mind. How do you think it functions in that way for him?
Well, in a very kind of obvious, you could say, Oedipal way, because it relates to his father and the way in which he will not dig like his father, he will write. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. It's probably a coincidence that the word gun features in the second line of Heaney's oeuvre, given the extent to which the poems that he writes about about violence in the late 60s and 70s are so much preoccupied with guns. He's using it here as a rather kind of innocent metaphor, or perhaps not so innocent, but certainly not in a kind of violent way. But violence will become kind of endemic in kind of the subjects that Heaney writes about.
It's a farmer's gun, isn't it, here, I think?
Yes, but beneath him is his father digging. Under my window, a clean, rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father digging. So he's making that contrast between his father as a kind of working the land, and he's working his imagination and writing poetry. And he establishes a relationship between them which is not at all patronising towards his father. I think that's one of the most uplifting or moving aspects of the poem, that it sees it very much values, some people might say overvalues, the kind of rural traditions which Heaney grew up with, and the extent to which his own ideal of, and we're talking about manhood here in particular, that this is very much a patrilineal poem. We might talk about his relationship with his mother and the mother of the Catholic Church a bit later, but he starts off with this patrilineal concept of himself as a writer, and it developing in some ways quite naturally out of a natural development from his father's digging. So there isn't this abrupt break. He's not rejecting his father's world at all. In fact, the opposite. Heaney draws on his childhood to an extent which is possibly comparable only to Wordsworth in the number of poems he manages to get out of those first 16, 17 years.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right to say that it's a wonderful poem about being up in his bedroom, presumably looking down on his father, but the poem is about not looking down on his father in another sense. And it's about a generational difference and a difference in your life prospects that comes from having different sorts of educational backgrounds. So in that sort of sense, it ties in with a lot of socially minded literature of the later 1960s about working class people who've been sent away to grammar school and then come back and don't click anymore. But as you say, it doesn't have that sense of disjunction in the end. He ends the poem by saying, between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, I'll dig with it. So, as you say, he's actually engaging in a way in exactly the same activity as his father.
A transposition into words of what his father's doing. And that was crucial for Heaney's sense of his own poetic imagination, its continuity. He has a metaphor he uses quite often relating to the myth of Hercules and Antaeus, that if Hercules can lift Antaeus off the ground, then he will lose his strength. So Heaney has to feel, even if he's being a jet setter, meeting the Empress of Japan one day, or attending the kind of 2500th anniversary of the birth of Sophocles another, he has to feel connected to the ground. And one way he does that, which was extremely effective and much liked, was by creating poetic sounds that replicate particularly the feel of wet Irish land, the cold smell of potato mould, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots. That people have often parodied the extent to which Heaney's poetry is mimetic of a certain kind of bogland, to use one of his most famous landscapes. But he has this extraordinary ability to use assonance and rhyme and all the kind of tricks of the poet's trade, which were in some ways a more, I won't say sophisticated, but a less kind of open-ended or less generous sense of the imagination might think that these were cliches, or might kind of reject them as somehow belonging to a school sort of poetry. Heaney was able to make use of them in a, I'm not saying an unself-conscious way, I think it was very self-conscious, but in a way that recovered them for poetry when they had been lost to irony and to the sense that poetry should be more sophisticated than that, more knowing, more postmodernist. So for those who feel kind of alienated or deracinated in the kind of post-war world, Heaney's poetry offered a kind of link back to a connection with the ground, to use that Antaeus metaphor. And a lot of the poems in this first book are about his childhood and about his ability to transcribe or kind of recreate moments from his childhood in Castle Dawson.
So if you have a particularly hard-nosed kind of reader, like, for example, Ian Hamilton, who writes about Heaney in the London Review of Books later, in the 1980s, Hamilton looks upon this sort of cult of onomatopoeia and this kind of very rich, kind of sensuous language, which is coming out of, I suppose, sort of a bit out of Hughes and a bit out of Hopkins and that sort of thing. He looks upon this with acute mistrust, really.
Yes, and Terry Eagleton has another piece on the Beowulf translation in which he talks of Heaney as kind of he talks of him as kind of theory allergic, and the theory would say that there's no connection between a thing and the word which presents that thing. But other readers of poetry have always enjoyed words which do pretend or create the illusion, at least, that they are squelching and slapping if they're describing something which is squelchy and slappy. So Heaney, coming from his, you talked about his time at Queen's Belfast. He was extremely well educated. I think that's a kind of primary thing to communicate. And he read not only in English but in Latin. He was taught Latin as well. And Virgil, particularly Aeneid Book 6, becomes crucial to him as and he translates that towards the end of his life. So there's many ways in which he was a very erudite poet who was also able to recover a kind of sensory primacy, I suppose, in these early poems, which seemed very fresh and new and original. And although it's been imitated, it did recover for poetry a lot of the things which late modernism or postmodernism seemed to suggested were illicit or not allowed anymore.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Series 1 of Modernish Poets. To listen to the full series and to all our other close reading series, sign up at lrb.me/close readings or click on the link below.